Hey guys, so we talked about the fact that genetic variation is one of the requirements for natural selection to occur. Today we're going to be going over what genetic variation is and where it comes from. So for this lesson on genetic variation, you need to know what genetic variation is and all of the different sources of genetic variation. You need to know the effects of mutations on a population. We're also going to go over how sexual reproduction affects genetic variation. And then lastly, what a gene pool is and why we care. So genetic variation is just the amount of different alleles of genes in a population. And an allele is just the different versions of a gene. So for example, if we're talking about the gene for eye color, you can have like the blue allele or the brown allele. The more genetic variation, the more adaptable that population is as a whole, which means that it's less likely to go extinct. In order for evolution to occur, the population also must have genetic variation, since genetic variation is a requirement of natural selection. And that's because natural selection can only select for a trait that is already in the population. Natural selection just makes that trait more common over time. It can't create a new trait. So for instance, if all of a sudden it became really beneficial to be a redhead, then the redhead trait would become more common because of natural selection. But if it all of a sudden became really beneficial to have naturally blue hair, since that allele or that option doesn't exist naturally in our population, natural selection couldn't act on it. Adaptations arise when a new gene enters the population, which is beneficial to those individuals. So some sources of genetic variation, some ways that we get more genes into our population. One is through mutations, which are just random changes in the DNA. And another is in sexual reproduction. You have more genetic variation because you have a mixture of DNA from two different people coming together. So the offspring is going to have different mixtures of genes than the parents, and also probably from the other offspring, unless they're twins or triplets or something like that. Genetic variation is maintained through sexual reproduction through two different processes that occur in meiosis. And we're not going to go in depth into what those processes are, just know that they happen in meiosis. So mutations. So DNA is the hereditary material that's passed from parents to offspring. Genes are the segments of DNA that code for specific traits. So you'll have like an eye color gene and a hair color gene, stuff like that. And then mutations are random changes in the DNA, which can result in a change in one of your genes. If the gene changes, then the trait that is coded for by that gene will also change. So that's one of the ways that we get new traits in a population, is through a mutation of one of the genes. If the new trait is beneficial, it's considered an adaptation. And then that new trait can be selected for if it improves survival. If over time that new trait that was only in one individual, it evolved in that one individual, if it becomes widespread in the population over time, then we say that that population has evolved. Usually in populations, there's a lot of mutations happening, but most mutations actually don't have any effect at all on the traits. They're called invisible mutations or silent mutations. And essentially that's because the mutations happen in like the junk part of your DNA that isn't actually genes, doesn't actually code for anything, or it changes the gene, but in a way that's like so minor, it doesn't affect how that gene is expressed. You can also have neutral mutations, which affect the trait, but doesn't affect the individual's fitness. So like, you know, like hazel eye color is like a mutation of brown eye color, but it's not an adaptation because it doesn't affect fitness. It's just a neutral mutation. It doesn't really matter. Harmful mutations are more common than beneficial ones, but because they decrease fitness, they're selected against, and so they don't build up in a population. Only beneficial mutations are actually selected for since they improve fitness. So those ones can build up over time in a population as they're selected for, and that's the ones that can cause a population to evolve. Some misconceptions about mutations. Firstly, mutations occur when they are needed in response to environmental changes. Again, mutations happen at random. Natural selection only works on the mutations that are already in the population, on the genes that are already in the population. You can't just be like, oh, it's getting really cold. I wish I had a mutation for more body hair, and then all of a sudden get that mutation. That mutation can only become more common in the population if someone already has it. Misconception number 2 is that because harmful mutations are more common than the beneficial ones, they will build up in a population over time. Again, harmful mutations are selected against, so they are always going to remain rare in a population. Because the individuals that have that don't survive long enough to pass it on a lot. Misconception number 3 is that since mutations are random, evolution is also pure chance. But because natural selection is driving evolution in a predictable way, evolution isn't pure chance. Evolution is always moving the population towards a better fit for its environment. It's not random. That's like a big misconception about evolution, is that it's random, but evolution is not random. It is based on natural selection, which is always pushing populations to be the best fit for their habitat as possible. Okay, sexual reproduction is when offspring are produced via the joining of sex cells from 2 different parents, so like a sperm and an egg coming together. Offspring will inherit a combination of genes from both parents, which means that the offspring is genetically different from the parents. That's the big benefit of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction. With asexual reproduction, the offspring are coming from a single parent, and therefore they will be identical to the parent. So asexual organisms have much less genetic diversity or genetic variation than sexual reproducing organisms. So there are a lot of downsides to sexual reproduction. It takes longer, it requires more energy. Not everyone is going to be able to sexually reproduce because not everyone will find a mate, but it has that big benefit of way more genetic variation, which means the populations are more adaptable and less likely to go extinct. There are 3 sources of genetic variation that are only found in sexually reproducing organisms. One is that there's variation between parents and offspring because the offspring is getting genes from both parents. The second is that there are variation between offspring of the same parents. So like you and your siblings, even if you have the same parents, will be genetically different from each other. And that's because the way that the genes from your 2 parents combine to make a child is random every time. So you're not going to get the same combination of genes from both parents in every child. And then lastly is that a lot of species that reproduce sexually are not monogamous. So having different parent combinations also increases genetic variation. And then, like I said, meiosis, there are a couple different processes in meiosis that contribute to genetic variation, but we're going to go into what those processes are in Bio 30. Okay, and then lastly, the gene pool. So the gene pool is just the name for all of the genes in a population. And anytime you have a mutation, you can get more genes in the gene pool. That's how you get adaptations. Evolution can only progress based on the genes that are already present in the gene pool, because natural selection can only work on the traits that are present in the population. The more genetic variation, or the larger the gene pool, the greater the evolutionary potential, the more different directions that population can evolve in, depending on how the environment changes. Evolution, the definition for evolution is a change in the population's gene pool. So over time, certain genes becoming more common or less common, that is evolution. The change in the gene pool is caused by natural selection. So some genes or some traits are selected for and become more common. Other genes and their traits are selected against and become less common. That is why we say that natural selection is the driving force of evolution, because the selective forces on the genes are what's going to change the gene pool. And all of that selective pressure is based on how those traits or those genes affect the fitness of those individuals. And again, by fitness, we don't mean physically fit, we mean how well they fit in their habitat. Okay, that is it for this unit. Next up, we're going to be moving on to photosynthesis and cellular respiration.